All good things must come to an end. The open source software world took a U-turn recently when the CentOS community announced End of Life for its operating system. But some skeptics note that you get what you pay for with anything that's free.
The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. Yet. Today's world teems with innovation. The nexus of hardware, software, and human ingenuity promises a revolution in possibilities. What does tomorrow look like? Witness Future Proof.
Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh, with an all-star cast here, folks. Today, we've really brought together some big minds and provocative thinkers to discuss CentOS 8 End of Life. Ooh, it doesn't sound good, does it? No, it doesn't sound good at all. So basically, CentOS, the community, announced that they're going to greatly expedite end of life for CentOS 8. Normally, I think it's 8 years that they'll have support for a particular operating system. This one was like a year in, like, nope, end of this year, it's all done. It's all going to CentOS Stream. So why is that a big deal? Well, we're going to find out from our guests today. We'll be talking to Joshua Drake from Command Prompt, who's also running the PostgreSQL conference. Dr. Jeffrey Malofsky, good friend of mine for many years now, who's got a lot of experience in the space. Javier Perez of Perforce, also an expert in the field, knows exactly what this all entails, and it's a big deal. And our good buddy Yves Mulkers is going to join us as well from all the way across the pond in Belgium. So I'll just quickly talk about the upgrade and who fears the upgrade. I know I'm in that category. I fear the upgrade simply because I know something's going to change. And so, and if you talk about an OS and upgrading your operating system, well, that has impact on everything else, everything downstream from the OS, all the apps that you use, all the integrations you built, all kind of stuff matters and can be affected and disrupted when you upgrade an operating system. DLL hell is one of the terms that we've heard in our pre-call today. You want to avoid DLL hell. I've been there. I spent years in the Microsoft world, and I remember in, let's say, the 90s, for example, if you were loading a new app or you bought some new application, it would ask you, which operating system are you on? And there would be like 12 versions of Microsoft, and then Mac OS and Linux, and that's it. So it's like, well, why are there 12 versions? And I think that's one of the reasons why Linux really took off and became a de facto standard for the enterprise, because it was stable. And of course, IBM stepped in to invest about $1 billion to harden Linux to make it a true enterprise caliber operating system. Well, let's go around the room and get some hot takes on what this all means. I'll go around the clock here as I see it. Joshua Drake from Command Prompt. Tell us a bit about yourself real quick, and what's your biggest comment on what you see happening with this end of life and what it means?
Hey, Eric. Well, I'm Joshua Drake, JD is what I go by. I am the founder of Command Prompt. We're an open source and PostgreSQL professional services firm. We've been around since '97. I actually been using Linux since before Red Hat existed. I was once a core member for the Linux documentation project. I've been published hundreds of times. I think what strikes me as the most surprising is people were surprised. The writing was on the wall. Once Red Hat decided to start merging or supporting CentOS, CentOS used to be a full community project. But once a corporation takes over direction of a project, it no longer is a project, it is a product. And they have to monetize that, and they have to modernize that, and they have to increase the value. Thus, it kind of makes sense what they did. I mean, rolling releases, streaming releases. SUSE, for example, has been doing it for years very successfully. And if you kind of want the old behavior, you can always buy Red Hat Enterprise and get the same experience you're used to.
Yeah, so I love that quote. I was surprised that they were surprised. Let's move around the room and get some early impressions as well. Dr. Jeffrey Malofsky, you've had a lot of experience in this space, of course, former scientist. I call Jeff the actual data scientist because he was an actual scientist before he went into data. So he's a real scientist with data. But you got a lot of experience with operating systems, and you yourself had to uninstall CentOS 8, reinstall CentOS 7 in order to run some of your technologies, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this will be a quickie, and then we'll get into the details of that more in a moment. But I come at it from a developer, a businessman, and a technical person building enterprise quality, hardened, secure data applications and running that on secure environments, and it has to be reliable. But you brought up the point of integration, and integration has a couple parts. So One is integration of all the various libraries. And for example, my new product, Datastar NG, runs on .NET on Linux. So then there's version issues there and a lot of libraries. But when you get into really large environments and ones with care about securing the environment, but also securing the data, you now have an enormous number of interdependencies, and it is incredibly non-trivial to make any change of any kind. In fact, in most cybersecurity environment, you can't change anything without starting the whole cybersecurity review process. And oh, by the way, that review process can take 6 months. So you definitely don't want anybody updating anything daily as a help function. So you definitely don't want to do that. So what I did is I did adopt CentOS 8. I heard the pronouncement went nutso, and then I did successfully, with a very detailed analysis of CentOS 7, down select to 7, but I modernized many of the core functions so I could get the benefits of 8, but I still was sticking with 7.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, it's not a small thing. And Javier Perez from Perforce, why don't you give us your impressions? Of course, you work in this space actively. What are your thoughts about the end of life and what it means?
Yes, Eric, and I agree with some of the comments here. Chief evangelist for Perforce. Before that, I worked for directly in open source communities and commercializing open source as heading of product management. Worked for a few startups, and full disclosure here, I used to work for Red Hat, although nothing to do with the Linux side of things. It was more on the Kubernetes OpenShift side of things. And then just before coming to Perforce, I worked for IBM. So I Red Hat before the IBM acquisition, at IBM after the Red Hat acquisition, advocating for open source, and that's what I've been doing for the last few years. My reaction was, yes, it shocked me like many other people, right? And as I hear JD, it's like, well, yeah, what were you surprised? This is what is happening a lot in the industry, in the open source space. In the modern open source space, all those successful open source projects are led by the largest corporations, right? So we hear about, how many projects Google is sponsoring and open it or donate it, and then promoting that. Microsoft, we can go on, of course, IBM, Red Hat, we can go on and on and on. And some of those successful projects, they are part of open source foundations, and there's a way to kind of control that if there are any differences, or if one company is trying to influence too much in one direction. In the case of CentOS, it was just one company, right? 2014, that's when Red Hat took full control, pretty much full control of the board of CentOS community, and they made that decision. And we'll talk about more about that in just a second. But the big piece here, I think everyone in the panel will agree with me, it's not really the CentOS stream, but really the big piece here was the end of life, right? And bringing it back 8 years, typically around 10 years, the full life cycle, about 5 on, consistent with the releases, and then they move to the next major release. So you are on long-term support, but that with expectations of have it for another 8 years, and all of a sudden you only have 1 year. This announcement was at the end of December 2020, and now you just have 1 year to see what you can do, right? And as you mentioned, it's always difficult to go, and it's not upgrading your phone, and we are nervous when we upgrade our phones, right? We're talking about applications, in many cases, mission-critical applications. We're also talking about thousands of websites that are on CentOS. So very shocking, very interesting part of the open source space.
Yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, there are lots of reasons why this happened. I mean, Joshua had his take on it, saying you shouldn't have been surprised. The cynical side of me thought the same thing, but of course you were over there, Javier, and the formal word was no, that IBM didn't have anything to do with this. But I wonder to myself, if you look at the maturation of the cloud and what we're dealing with on that front with Google, for example, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, all of them moving so fast to build out these cloud architectures, was that a factor to some extent? Because I know the CentOS stream I believe is more Kubernetes friendly. But can you kind of comment on that? What are your thoughts about that, Javier?
Well, I frankly believe the official announcement by the CentOS community and Red Hat, which they did it obviously at the same time, and they said, look, between Fedora and the release of RHEL the major release of RHEL, there's a big gap there, right? And there's a lot of work that we do from that Fedora version, testing, productizing things, fixing bugs, security vulnerabilities. There's a lot of work that it's done, and it's done behind closed doors. It's done at Red Hat, and then we come out with a RHEL release. So the official explanation is, well, all that work that we've been doing behind closed doors, now let's do it on the open, right? Like a traditional open source project where we have constant updates, constant builds, right? The whole continuous integration, continuous delivery. Yes, and then there's also for them a big opportunity to modernize their processes, right? Packaging, we're not talking about a few thousand, we're not talking about a few hundred libraries, we're talking about thousands of libraries, thousands of packages that they have to go test, basically package,
right,
deal with the dependencies. So there was that factor about modernization as well, and then being more on the open. For people that are not familiar with, the audience that are not familiar with, CentOS typically was really just a copy of RHEL, right? And there were some small changes, taking some of the artwork or some of the branding, the Red Hat branding. But for the most part, it was a really stable releases that we had with CentOS, and you know, that's one of the reasons why it became so popular.
Yeah, I'll turn that over to Joshua to comment on. I do remember reading about this, and it does make a lot of sense to now do the sort of testing around in the open as opposed to behind closed doors. But what are your thoughts about that, and about maintaining the kind of community that CentOS has built? Because communities of developers are who put these technologies forward, right? I mean, if you have a critical mass of developers working on your platform, you're going to be okay. If you don't, you're not going to be okay. And I think we've kind of seen that over the years. But what are your thoughts about that explanation that CentOS Stream will all be done kind of in the open, and that should be good news for the community? What do you think, Josh or JD?
I would agree that it would be good for the community. You know, I'm a big fan of CentOS and Red Hat, but, you know, short story, one of the organizations that I do work for is a very large public library system, one of the largest in the nation. And because of the Red Hat traditional model, which is, you know, support forever, I ended up having to essentially build a new version of Red Hat that ran on top of an old version of Red Hat within, for lack of a better way to explain it, within a container, so that we could run modern software, because all the libraries were outdated and the organization wasn't willing to upgrade, quote unquote, the enterprise. Moving to a streaming release, I mean, you can still get your traditional support from Red Hat if you need that kind of longevity and stability. But the reality is most people don't. Most people, they get upgrades. I mean, think about your phone. How often does your phone upgrade? Every day, all day long, there's a new app or a new app upgrade. Most people don't need the type of stability we're talking about. And that includes in commerce.
Right.
So I don't see a problem with it.
Interesting. Dr. M, I'll throw it over to you. And we do have a couple of good questions already from the audience asking about, like one person asks, how many upstream distros are needed? Fedora is already there. Why add CentOS? Can you kind of talk about that, Jeff?
Sure. And again, coming from my perspective, it's a little bit different. So the use case is much more rigid, much more stringent, and has a very large, very, very large investment in time and manpower to get the operating system and the applications running on it working reliably and securely. And I want to keep bringing back the word security, because I spent most of my time in those networks and on the product development dealing with the interactions of the required security changes to the operating system configuration and the impact that had on everything else in the system. And in fact, it became so onerous that I frequently was in the source code for Hadoop I was in the source code for some of the Linux libraries, and my team had to show at the source code level why we were requesting a waiver for one of maybe 3,000 discrete settings that were required. So now if you go through all that and get it working, I'm not going to allow a streaming update. So let me put it out there. If you're in a large organization with a secure footprint, it's a non-starter. No streaming updates will be allowed whatsoever. What you have is an update and patch schedule, and that's not daily. And what you're supposed to do is essentially do DevOps on the patch and check it out and do the scanning. But you also have to test all of your own code. Everyone talks about the libraries. Well, when you have an enterprise product that's horizontally scaling to do real-time streaming data prep of terabyte files, well, guess what? It's stressing the system a great deal. So then all those things have to work, and they've been tested, they've been performance tested, the security is there. Security changes frequently, you gotta stay on top of that. So no, not only is it not a positive to do streaming updates, it's an absolutely forbidden subject to do so. Then to answer the CentOS versus the others, a large part of it is, which Javier was talking about, is that particularly if you get into the secure world, Red Hat leads the pack by far in investing a great deal into hardening the Linux distributions. And so having CentOS there allowed, even if you are going into an organization which has the Red Hat support, a lot of times you're doing development, and you don't necessarily want the Red Hat support on your development servers. They're internal, you're walled off, you want to try and experiment with a lot of things. So it was very beneficial to choose that and now actually be able to try to break the security or the scalability separately before you went into full production. So from that vantage point, that end of life, like Javier said, but also the streaming is non-trivial. The streaming was just a non-starter, just would not allow it.
Yeah, that's
So I would
interesting.
agree.
Go ahead quickly.
Real quick.
30
I
seconds.
would agree with him. I know there's certain workloads that's relevant to, and it makes perfect sense. So buy Red Hat. I mean, we're complaining about something that was given to us for free.
Talking about the foundation of the information economy, folks, operating systems. That's right. They're all over the place. They are very important. When you change them, bad things can happen. Good things can happen too. Obviously, there's a reason you do the upgrade is to get the new stuff. But this CentOS 8 end of life announcement late last year has been very disruptive. We're talking to JD of Command Prompt, Dr. Milosky of Datastar NG, Javier Perez of Perforce, and Eve Mulkers of 7W Data. And Eve, I'm going to step back and let you do the questions for this segment. So Eve, give us your impressions and then take it away with questions for our guests.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for that. My impressions, kind of surprised. I think we mentioned that just in the previous section already, to be surprised. Just first let your community upgrade to the newest version to have those new features, and then say, okay, you better stay on the previous version. That's really a big disillusion to be confronted with that. So my idea about it is as well, will this break some trust in open source, where you become more afraid of where it is going with open source, and that you think the big commercial companies, yes, they do invest, and after a while you still have to pay to get to open source? I don't know what is your take on that, Joshua?
I don't think that it's going to break trust in open source as a whole. I mean, open source at this point is pervasive, and most people don't even realize they're running it, right? If you have a phone, you're running open source, and it doesn't matter what phone. The reality is that this is kind of par for the course. Open source can be trusted. I mean, you can look at the PostgreSQL project, which has been around since ’97 and strives very deeply to provide a stable situation. But business is changing. And I think that there's a real possibility for trust to improve, actually, because Red Hat has been very clear about what the purpose is, how they're going about it. There are opportunities for you to get the same behaviors that you had beforehand, but they have to appeal to the new generation. It's just like the Kubernetes, community. I can't stand Kubernetes. I see no point of it. But I know lots of people that are younger than me that will rave about it. product. And evolution is in progress, is just the way it goes. As long as it's managed properly, I don't think it'll break trust among the future check writers, which is what we're really talking about here.
Yeah, that's interesting. Go ahead, Yves, take it away.
Yeah, I think that's a nice perspective where you say it's a change in the culture, a change into a generation that is used to a different way of working. I mean, we're very likely all at the age where we started with the command prompt and still are very into that environment. We know if you're talking about DLLs, about libraries, how that all ties together. I still recall the days from Windows in the beginning, DLL hell, and trying to get to a stable environment, which has been supported by the community now in open source, where you had the access to, I don't know, 50,000 developers, where otherwise where you had to pay these people to make a stable product was much more, was much harder to achieve that type of stability. So the idea is as well, do you see more people jumping onto commercial licenses of the Linux distributions, or would that have an impact on the general operation of organizations, Jeff?
I think that once you get to a large organization, they're already invested, Joshua said, JD has said, in getting the Red Hat support. You have to have support, paid support and paid maintenance in a large organization. So I don't think that's going to change that. I think it's going to be the small companies that are going, where they were trying to maybe do it themselves or have just an offsite help desk, that they're probably more concerned now, because the truth is you have resource limitations. You can only do so much. And as a startup company, I can tell you that's a significant issue. You only have so much resource, you only have so much to do. And you also have a project plan, a timeline, a milestone, which means that if I've configured it and I've trusted something, I don't want to go backwards in time. That's going to make a serious impact on me. So I don't think it hits open source per se. I think that, like people were saying, definitely looking around for alternatives, Rocky being the obvious one. Again, just because of the world I'm in and the things I do with the large data and large secure operations, and I've gone through the penetration testing, I've gone through the audit. So again, if you haven't had the misfortune of having to prove to auditors, that you have detailed 3,000 discrete items in your risk management framework, then you're a lucky person. But having done that, I don't want to have to relive that. So I would say I would be looking for alternatives, but it's critically important that I have open community support for all the ramifications of those security settings. I've actually had Hadoop crash, by the way. So with one of the core libraries in the Linux kernel, when I started out, I was using one of the upper grade Linux 6 kernels, and it flat out, Hadoop said it was working, but it just crashed every time. And tracking down what the corrupt kernel, not corrupt, but the problematic was not easy to do. So then we did that. 7 was more stable. But in that world, I would say the small people, it's probably worth getting at least a help desk support person that you can reach out to. And if you want to, and then in production, obviously you want paid maintenance, but it does make you think about moving somewhere else.
If I can just add on that point, yeah, I agree. I don't think there's going to be a mistrust in the open source community. I think open source is here to stay, and it keeps growing, right? You see the numbers across the board. It's all growing across programming languages, technologies. Obviously, there's a bit more now on what is called cloud native, container based, and so on. But it's a trend. It's not a trend. It's just happening. Operating systems, for a long time has been the Linux kernel and the Linux subsystem have been really an example of how to run open source, right? 30 years in the making, right? It's actually 1991. That's when Linus Torvalds built his first version of Linux. Now, so it's now 30 years now. We have all these other companies, large organizations, and many developers, thousands of developers contributing to the Linux kernel and the Linux subsystems. So operating system keep improving. And now we have a variety. It's not just one or two. We're going to have another session on the different options, but we have a variety of Linux distributions out there, Now, and we'll talk about also about how complicated it is to move away from CentOS or from a fork or a copy of CentOS or RHEL. But there's a long list of Linux distributions out there. Some of them coming from others, like some coming from Debian, for example, or some really coming from the GNU Linux kernel. But so I trust, I really believe that open source is not going to be affected for things like this. We've seen time and time again that all of a sudden one influential company makes a big news, right? Some of you might recall more recently the Elastic with their change on their open source licenses. Big scandal. Actually, that made now there's a fork. Now there's another search or similar to Elasticsearch from that. We also was a scandal with MongoDB at some point, right? Remember, some of you might remember, MongoDB putting all those resources to develop in the open, just like Red Hat or CentOS been happening, and then all the infrastructure providers, the AWSs, the Googles, and the Azures were offering, pretty much for free or very cheap, right? So they went and changed their licenses and say, hey, it's all open source, but you can host it on the cloud, and that created also controversies, right? So you have in open source today, and not only operating systems, but in open source today, it's been driven by those investments from the large companies, right? That they basically paying full-time developers to work full-time upstream, working full-time on open source. Now, that doesn't stop anyone else to just go and start contributing and, pay your dues and become a committer, a maintainer of any project. But it's today's open source has been influenced for the large organizations. And then, going to Jeff's point, this is complex, right? Now we're talking about thousands of libraries, thousands of dependencies. If you have a vulnerability in one of those dependencies, sometimes you don't even know that you have it, and it's like 2-3 layers down on the dependencies of your library, and that's where the vulnerability is, or that's where the patch for the vulnerability is available, and you have to deal with all of that. So it does require a lot of expertise, and some organizations say, hey, I would just rather pay for it, right? I just rather pay the commercial version of that open source project, and there are other options like the company that I work for, Perforce, so we offer this open logic support that we just go and help you out with all these complications of open source, working with open source projects.
So I want to jump in here. First, Yves, how we were talking about some of us start at the command prompt. I'll remind you that's the name of my company, Command Prompt, right? That's how long we've been doing this. But back to Javier, you actually spoke to why open source isn't going to lose trust, because everything that's happening is the power of open source. I remember when the x386 developers got full heads and changed their license. Well, guess what? It forked. Now we run X Windows and freedesktop.org, and that other project is dead. You can go even farther back if you start researching the history of a real Unix like FreeBSD, right, and their heritage. Or you can look at with MongoDB, when they changed their license, a rather large cloud vendor said, okay, we'll just bolt MongoDB onto PostgreSQL, and that's called DocumentDB. And they're doing the same thing with Microsoft SQL with Babelfish, right? So that's kind of why I don't think it's going to violate the trust of open source, is because it is all there and it is all transparent, versus, say, a corporation that bought another large corporation and said they would never take Java in-house, and now it's in-house. So I think that losing faith in open source is kind of the wrong direction, right? Because it's the power of open source that allows us to have that faith and make those choices in the first place.
Yeah, everyone moving away from Oracle and to OpenJDK. Right?